You need to have free play and structured play implemented back in your homes, and you need to have it implemented back in your schools, and you need to be purposeful in terms of teaching those competencies around social and personal awareness and emotional well-being and understanding emotions and learning how to self-soothe and do all that. And so,
welcome to the Soaring Child podcast, where parents of children with ADHD learn tips and tricks to help their child soar at home, at school, and in life. We feature interviews with experts, medical professionals, and parents just like you who are learning how to reduce ADHD symptoms using food and other natural strategies. Because children with ADHD deserve to soar just like every other child. I'm Dana Kay, your host. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Soaring Child podcast. Now, as parents, we're constantly navigating how to best support our children, especially, when we face these challenges like ADHD. And I remember, when my son was struggling with sort of that frustration and social interactions, it was extra hard. I really wanted to help him sort of regulate his emotions, but didn't know where to start. And I wondered constantly, how can I equip him with the tools to manage his emotions, not just now, but also when he grows into an adult? The truth is, emotional intelligence, it isn't just a skill. It's kind of like this foundation for mental health and resilience, and it's something that we can, nurture in our children. But here's the twist: it doesn't have to feel like work. Play, which is a natural and really joyful part of childhood, can also be one of the most effective ways to build these skills. And that is why I'm super excited to welcome Leroy Slanzi to the podcast. He brings 25 years of experience as an educator and has dedicated his career to, exploring the connections between emotional intelligence, mental health, and education. He's also the author of Emotional Schools, The Looming Mental Health Crisis, A Pathway Through It, which, one of the reasons I wanted to, bring him here on the podcast. It's a book that really dives into the challenges schools and families face today and really offers actionable solutions. Leroy's unique approach really combines the emotional awareness with the power of play, and it just offers this fresh perspective on how to help our children thrive. Leroy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
thank you for having me. I'm excited about this conversation.
I am. And when I read the title of your book, I was like, I have got to get him on the podcast. I think,
For
what
sure.
you're doing is just so fundamental. And, just before we started this conversation, or we pressed record, I was just mentioning the whole education system, I think needs to change. We don't put as much focus as we should on this emotional intelligence.
Mhm. This is true, and not only for kids, for staff as well. And
Yes.
I know you and I talked about ADHD prior to, and how challenging it is. And there's a lot of education that needs to happen for teachers around it as well, because there's a lack of understanding. One of the things that I didn't say in my bio, I also have a master's in special education, and so I've worked with students in the special education realm for a long time. And you'd be amazed at how many schools I've been in where I have to do a massive amount of professional development for teachers in my schools, because they don't get learning disabilities, they don't get neurodiversity, they don't get mild intellectual disabilities, oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit. They just don't. And so you have to really incorporate that as a leader into a school. And actually, to plug it, I just wrote a third book that I just released for leaders around leading through emotional intelligence, and that instructional pillar is so important for these kids, right?
Yeah, it's so important. And I think it should be part of degrees, the
Mm-hmm.
teachers training. I think it's so fundamental, especially with the increase in rates of kids that are suffering these days, especially coming out of the pandemic. So listeners, if you are tuning in this might be a really good podcast to share with your school. If we
Absolutely.
can share this message far and wide, we're the army people on the ground trying to, spread this message. And so let's try and spread that message that, we need to bring this into school. Look, Leroy, your journey in education, it spans like 25 years. I'm curious what actually inspired you to sort of focus on emotional intelligence, and right emotional schools.
Yeah, well, for me personally, I've always been naturally able to connect with kids. Emotional intelligence is something that I've always had this intuitive nature of feeling a room. I can feel the aura. When I walk into a school, I don't even have to talk to people. You can just feel that aura.
Mm.
And that's the real key to emotional intelligence, is to understanding the emotional perspective of the person you're with and yourself. And so when I started working with vulnerable kids right off the bat 25 years ago, back in the day when they used to stream kids with learning disabilities, behavior issues into one classroom, and diagnoses for kids were not there. They're just weird kids, and so I was in one of those classes as a classroom teacher, and which led me into doing my master's in special ed. And it just sort of grew from there after teaching and working with at-risk youth and vulnerable youth, and then being a special ed teacher. I was only teaching for 6 years before I got into admin, and it was probably, and I've said this, I don't know how many times, it started with sleep deprivation about 15 years ago, where I really started to see that emotional need in schools in terms of understanding what is going on for our kids and for our parents and for our teachers. And it really, the catalyst came, it was pre-COVID for me, even though COVID really threw it over the edge. But pre-COVID, teachers were burning out and leaving the profession even before COVID because of the behavioral changes in the classrooms, the lack of support. And one of the things that I fight with a lot of times is school districts and governments not really understanding that social emotional learning, that developing emotional intelligence is putting the horse before the cart. Throwing teachers into literacy and numeracy and assessment workshops is great, but you can't get there if you can't teach the kids those skills because of behavior. And so yeah, it was for me, the catalyst was my teachers burning out, and veteran teachers who've been at it for 20 years, just people who should not go because they have so much to offer, and they were like, nah, I'm packing her in. and
Yeah.
and I thought, okay, we really need to try to turn some rocks over and make a difference in schools and
Yeah,
whatnot.
and
So
that's what you're doing. Why is emotional intelligence, such a critical factor in schools and maintaining that really good mental health throughout life, especially in our children?
Well, it's important because it allows you, when I look at emotional intelligence, I look at your own personal awareness and a social awareness. So you have to be able to self-reflect, and you have to recognize what you're feeling and labeling those emotions, because you're going to present yourself to another person or a group of people. And then on top of that, the social awareness piece is really trying to identify who's in front of you and what schema they bring to the table. And one of the buzzwords out there is trauma informed practice. And I work in an Indigenous school right now. I work for a Lower Nicola Indian band, and the residential school trauma that our
Mm.
people here in Canada face, and in the United States, quite honestly, in terms of go back into colonization. And don't get me started on Thanksgiving and whatnot, but you really have to approach people through that trauma informed lens and that social and personal awareness lens, because when you can do that, it allows you to stay calm. It allows you to think and have conversations that are going to be proactive. And emotional intelligence allows you to communicate really well, recognize body language, facial expressions, that oral communication piece. And it also allows you to think critically yourself or in a team, and to be more creative. It creates all of those opportunities for kids to develop a skill set that allows them to grow. And on top of that, it also allows you, by recognizing your own emotional well-being, it allows you to learn how to self-soothe, which then allows you to cope with stress. And that's one of the biggest things that I think across all over the world. And like I said, I've been to Australia, and that's where I really dove into this Play is the Way program that I do a lot of workshops for throughout British Columbia and into other parts of Canada, is that kids can't cope with small stressors anymore. They can't. They just, because of play diminishing, because of social media, because of the lack of attachment at home, because parents are on their phones more than interacting, we're seeing this dissipation of grit, perseverance, resiliency, really emotional kids. And on top of it, because of phones and because parents are also ignoring their kids and kids are playing gaming, I see, and I've seen it every year, it seems to grow, more and more need for speech language pathologists in kindergarten because kids aren't orally communicating. And so speech language pathologists are going to be the next shortage that we have. It already is a shortage. We don't have enough of them because kids aren't learning to speak, because there's the free play is disappearing, the structured play is disappearing. And schools, really need to take heed.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like from what you're saying that it really starts with us adults. We
Mm-hmm.
start the learning process for our children.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always kind of bring up with teachers and parents, because the blame game happens, right? I'm going to blame the parents. I'm going to blame the school. And meanwhile, we have these kids who are growing up in a generation with technology in their faces, right? This is our generation. Both of my kids are teenagers now, but they have cell phones. That's on their tool belt. That's what they know, right? It's like, we lived with the rotary phone and having to
Yes.
turn a channel on TV. But this is what and you're not getting rid of it, right? And so we can't blame the kids for the state and the era that they're living in. But what we can do as parents is try to go back to what we had when we grew up and realize that attachment was a big part of it. And free play was a big part of us developing that resiliency, because, when as a kid, you'd leave the house, you didn't have a cell phone, your parents sent you out, you come back for lunch 3 hours later. While you're interacting with your friends, there's conflict.
Yeah.
You're having to figure out what games you're going to play. You're going to have to, you don't have a lot of toys. You're playing with sticks and rocks. So the creativity's there. So all of those skills like communication that I talked about, critical thinking, all that, we developed that through free play. We also developed that with parents because we played board games, or they played hide and seek with us, or, or if dad was outside digging, you were digging, and chores and all those things. And that stuff, because, we live in a world now where both parents are working. There's less of that. We live in this culture of fear where we're afraid our kids are going to get kidnapped. So there's less throwing them out in the middle of the street and saying, go play soccer or kick the can or basketball because you're worried.
Come home before dark, you'll be fine.
That's right. And I did some research and I just can't remember, but I do believe there isn't as many abductions as there used to be, because there's more cameras. It's harder to do, right? And so, but we still live in that system. And so, you need to have free play and structured play implemented back in your homes, and you need to have it implemented back in your schools, and you need to be purposeful in terms of teaching those competencies around social and personal awareness and emotional well-being and understanding emotions and learning how to self-soothe and do all that. And so that's what I do. And I'm a principal right now in a school, and that's what I've been in high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, and I incorporate a wraparound model where at the center of what we do is a social emotional learning platform, trauma informed practice. And so I do that, but I also do a lot of workshops where I go and work with schools and I try to help them transform their school plans to incorporate this stuff. Because you mentioned teacher programs. In these programs, they teach class management rather than behavior education. and we can all flick lights on and off, raise our voice if we need kids to be quiet, or, do something to get kids to be mindful and listening. But at the end of the day, we need to teach behavior. We need to teach about emotions. We need to teach kids how to self-soothe and regulate and grit and perseverance, because it's gone.
Yeah, it's gone. And it sounds like, that unstructured play, it's that lost art in today's world. So, we've probably got a lot of listeners, parents, educators,
Mhm.
wondering how do they create these environments and really encourage that play so we can support that emotional well-being and mental health.
Yeah, I part of my, like, I'm a principal, I'm an author. I also have my own educational consulting business, and I work with parents around how to, develop their kids in terms of their skill and character and whatnot. And I think the biggest thing that I typically will tell parents when they start is learn how to structure and schedule technology. Because the
Mm.
moment you can, make sure you have a rule at the dinner table, go back to having dinners. Let's start there. Sit together and have dinners. But there should be no technology at the dinner table or the breakfast table. Don't get rid of technology, because that's where people go. It's like, you know what, let's just get rid of it. Well, you get rid of it. This is where the kids live. This is their generation. So you're not helping them by getting rid of it, because eventually they're going to get it and then they're not going to know what to do with it. But if you schedule it and tell kids, you know what, you can game for a couple hours, but first, as a family, we're going to go kick the soccer ball around. We're going to go for a hike. We're going to go fishing. We're going to go down to the local swimming pool. And you've got to get back into scheduling
Mhm.
attachment, scheduling that back in, right? And that's the key. And then when your kids have a passion, or you start seeing them, I'll use Lego, for example. If your kid loves Lego, encourage that, because you encourage that, that's creativity. They're going to be using their hands, those sorts of those fine motor skills, and they're building things. And then you can purposefully, while your kid is doing that, you can say, hey, have you ever built a model airplane? And then all of a sudden you're in a model airplane. Or, I'll use my daughter, for example. She was fascinated with mermaids when she was little. So I ended up finding her a mermaid tail that she can wear in the swimming pool. And so she
Mm.
had this mermaid tail. Every time we went public swimming, she was a mermaid. She ended up being in swim club, learned how to do butterfly faster than everybody else because she was a mermaid. But we chased that passion, which then led to her learning how to be intrinsically motivated. My son, same thing. Might have been dinosaurs, and then it was basketball, and we just chased those passions that weren't technology based. And those passions allow parents to incorporate intrinsic motivation, and then they can be purposeful around, hey, well, you like basketball, you should try this. Or, you like this, you should try this. I even think of the time my kids were both wanting to find four-leaf clovers because they were watching Dora the Explorer. And I'm like, let's go. We had magnifying glasses. We were out searching for four-leaf clovers. And that's what parents should be doing in the house. They don't need to get rid of this. They just need to schedule it, right?
Mhm.
And they also need to schedule in that time to attach and develop those curiosities for kids that are natural, right?
100%. That's one of the things that, we really talk about a lot is that, I know it might seem super overwhelming for parents to, oh, I've got to sit down and play with my kid. But even if you just schedule 10
Mhm.
minutes a week to start. Once you do that 10 minutes a week, then you can do it 10 minutes twice a week. And it's really just about those small, slow steps that they can make to
Yeah.
really bring change into your family. So, look, we've discussed some of the things that parents can do at home. What about schools? What about teachers?
Well, I'm going to use the school that I'm currently in. So one of the things that I've done at this school is, so, during a school day, my school day is 8:30 to 2:30. So it's a 6-hour day with lunch and recess in there. And then there's transition time between classes. So I've managed to steal transition time here and there. So I've implemented 2 recesses and a lunch. So
Hmm.
my kids come to school and they play, free play in the morning when they get there, if they finish their breakfast and whatnot. And if they want at breakfast time, they can play Monopoly, Risk, Jenga, if they don't want to go outside and play. But at recess, they go outside and play. Then they have a second recess where they go outside and play. And then lunchtime, they go outside and play. And then on top of that, we have phys ed classes, and we run a program called Play is the Way that is a structured program where we teach kids how to deal with emotions through play. So what we do is we will play a structured game, and we will literally elicit emotion and behavior from them. So we will elicit frustration.
So talk me through that.
Yes. So yeah, exactly. And so on Mondays, we have our assemblies, and here at our Indigenous school, we drum and we do the cultural piece, and then we dive in. I talk. You can see some of these colored posters behind me.
Yeah.
So these are the key concepts. Those are the common language that we use as a school. And the purple poster back here, it asks questions like, am I doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Or am I making a strong decision or a weak decision? Am I the master of my emotions or the victim of my emotions? And so what I do is I play a game, and in that assembly every Monday, and I make it harder and harder. And then I challenge them. I tell them, I said, you know what, I'm going to make you guys emotional. If you can't take deep breaths and calm, you're going to end up being the victims of your emotions, and I'm going to beat you. And they don't want to lose to the principal, right? And so I just do that with them. And then in the middle of the game, we stop. I wrote a book called And Breathe. That's 50 breathing strategies for parents and teachers. So I literally steal the breathing strategies out of my own book, and we'll do bumblebee breathing or snake breathing in the middle of the game. So I'm teaching them to soothe while they're heightened, and I bring them back down, and we go at it again, and I'll make it a little bit harder. And then I'll bring their emotions up, and I'm like, okay, stop. Deep breath. Let's do some bumblebee breathing. Zzz, and they all do it, and they calm. I'm like, okay, you're calm. I said, I feel like I'm going to get the next point, because now if you do this, I'm going to win. And I just keep changing the rules. And they're like, you're changing the rules. I'm like, absolutely, because that's how life works, right? And so our teachers also then, that gets supplemented with these that common language from kindergarten to grade 7. And then when kids are out on the playground or in classrooms, and if they start being emotional, teachers instantaneously go, okay, let's do some bumble breathing. We need to soothe. Why are we soothing? We're soothing so that way we're not the victims of our emotions, and our thinking can be in charge, right? And so we teach that in kindergarten. So I'll use an example. I got a little kindergarten kid who often visits me. I don't have an office. I actually work in a place called a calming space. That's the name on the wall, and that's where my office is. So I'm in here with kids where if teachers are struggling with their kids and they're not being able to calm, they'll come to me 3-4 times a day, and we work on breathing strategies, and then we'll do a lot of interactive play and stuff. But I got a little guy now, he comes in, and whether he's hit another kid or you still see those behaviors, but he'll come in and he's like, I didn't do the green poster. I forgot. And he's talking the talk. He's not walking the walk. But guess what? By grade 1, he's going to start walking the walk, and he's going to know how to self-soothe. He's going to know how to persevere, be resilient, because we've incorporated structured and free play so much. And even that, when our kids are out at recess, I tell the teachers, if you see kids in a conflict, because teachers like to dive in and be like controlling, because that's how we are. I'm like, let them see if they figure it out. Jump in if they're going to go to blows, try to get there before that. But let's see if they can, work through this yelling and screaming and see what happens. And so we allow them to work through that, just like we would in the past when there was no adults watching us play. And so we're making sure there's safeness there, and there's safety in terms of nobody's getting hurt, but we allow them to work through it. Like it's super important.
It is like the future of education. This should be in every single school.
Yep.
Across the world.
It should be. And you know what the cool thing about it is that it embeds into what you do. So it's not one of the biggest things for teachers and principals, if you're listening, when you implement a program like this and you bring me in to train your staff to do this, you don't have to find 30 minutes a day to do it. You don't. It's embedded into what you do, because when kids show emotion, you dive right into being able to self-soothe, reminding them, and you develop that while they're working in socials, math and science and recess. But the hard part is that you have a lot of principals, a lot of district people who don't really understand how important social emotional learning is, because they haven't been in the trenches to feel the behavior like teachers have. And then when teachers go and say, hey, I need to bring Leroy in to do this Plays the Way workshop, funding comes up, or they're like, oh no, we need to focus on numeracy, or we need to focus on literacy. It's like, yes, you do, but you can't get to it as well as you could if your kids can't deal with their stress, right?
Yeah.
And so
And
that's,
so I think the call to action right here for listeners is maybe let's share it with the principals. Right, the teachers, yes, they can be the warriors, but I think it's got to start at the top. Now, you've mentioned it's important for the adults to have that emotional resiliency and intelligence. And I know that you talk a lot about play for adults as well. So, what activities do you recommend for parents and for educators really looking to improve their own emotional intelligence and mental health?
yeah, I think the biggest thing, if you go on social media, there's so many videos out there about for adults around being mindful and meditating and dealing with all that trauma that we carry, because we have a lot of baggage. I'm 50, be 51 in a week or so, and my parents divorced. My mom went elsewhere, took my brother and sister. We all have baggage, and so
Mhm.
it's all about us learning how to understand when we're feeling emotional. So this, again, I'm going to refer to this purple poster because it's a self-mastery checklist. As teachers, I will have conversations like, did you read it today? Because you're coming in really off keister, and they're like, and we're in such a safe place as a school because we talk about the importance of breathing and perseverance, because it's not just for the 5-year-old, the 30-year-old, the 50-year-old. You lose your keys in the morning, you have a flat tire, get into a fight with your husband or your wife or for me, my teenage 16-year-old daughter, when I knock on her door and she screams at me because I woke her up, it's like you come to work and you're like, we have to take deep breaths. We have to be mindful. And that's the best part about, having a school that's socially, emotionally aware, is that the adults go, oh my God, this has been so helpful. Even for me, when I made that shift 10 years ago, to being purposeful in social emotional well-being rather than just doing it naturally, I was like, holy, it changed who I was as an administrator, it changed who I was as a person. It just allowed me to be mindful of my own emotional well-being. And that's the key, right? And I think when you're working with your staff as a leader, that relational leadership piece and that servant leadership piece, and like I said, it's part of the reason why I just wrote that latest book. It's for leaders to really incorporate emotional intelligence into how you lead, because if you have those relationships with staff and your school is a safe place, you can say to so and so, it's like, whoa, you're having a rough go today, hey, and call them out on it in a
Mm.
safe way. And they were like, yep. It's like, hey, you know what, go take 15 minutes in the staff room and cover your class, right? And because you're in a school that's social emotion aware, principals actually create more time for themselves because the behavior decreases because kids can control their own emotions, which allows you to go and cover a teacher's class or go and help the custodian clean up, or go and answer some phone calls for the secretary or whatever, right? And it becomes a community, and then the academics just shoot through the roof. I've been in the school for about 2.5 years, and it was a bit discombobulated when I got here, but it's now in a place where we're seeing our reading levels go up, our numeracy levels go up, the behavior. I don't deal with behavior with kids in grade 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Most of my behavior is kindergarten, grade 1, 2, because they're just learning. And like I said, they're talking the talk, but very few grade 3s. And once in a while, I'll get something from the intermediate kids because they saw something on social. Like, for example, this week they were calling each other Diddy, as in Sean Puff Diddy there. And I'm like, oh boy. So I had to bring him in. I'm like, you guys, do you know what that's all about? And they're like, no, but the name is cool. I'm like, well, let me tell you. And we have a conversation. And then we go back to our common language. And we have this orange poster, which revolves, it's the golden rule, which you know about. It's been around for ages. And we're like, yeah, do you think Diddy's the right thing to be calling people? No way, right? And so, but we can have
I'm
a
laughing,
conversation.
and for listeners, you wouldn't be able to see me smiling. It's just that I've got about to be 11 and 15-year-old boys, and so I'm smiling because I know exactly what you're talking
You
about.
do. Yeah, you do, right? And it's the world they live in. And I had to go through it with my son and my daughter with the music they were listening to. That was just, holy man. I was like, you're learning, you're hearing that. And it's like, you got to pick your battles, right? Because you also don't want them to hide that music, because then you can't talk about that music and what the content is and all of that sort of stuff. And but it's important learning, right? And so I think the more schools and principals incorporate a social emotional learning program, it may be a little bit of money to start, but they're going to save so much money on the back end, so
Yeah.
much money on the
And
back
I
end.
100% agree with you on that. But it also comes into the home. And so, I'm curious, are there any particular sort of types of play or activities that you find the most beneficial for the mental health and the emotional growth of children, especially with things like ADHD or ODD?
Yeah, you know what? All of them. And the reason why all of them is because they're inclusive and they teach kids how to be empathetic, compassionate, and caring individuals. And when kids do that, they know how to handle. So I'm going to use my little guy who's in kindergarten, where he hits and spits and does those things. But as classmates now, are able to understand that's like he's a bit different in terms of how he's managing things, and they will literally go on over to him and try to help him breathe, help him calm and get through it. And they're taking on that role of a teacher, that big brother, that big sister. And it's a slow process when you have a kid who has ODD or ADHD, but it's there and it's just ingrained into the culture of the school. So when you use those games and you teach this stuff to the greater community, they're like, I play this one particular game, it's called Islands, and there's a whole bunch of hula hoops around. And when I yell Islands, the rule is you have to have 4 kids in a hoop, a girl and a boy, a primary and an intermediate student. And if you don't, I get the point. And so what happens is no kid can be left on an island, because if they are, they lose. So they're always scrambling there, and they have to look for a girl or a boy or an intermediate student or a little primary kid, and they pull them into these hoops, and you'll have 6 or 7 kids in there, and they're squeezing each other trying to stay in the hoop. Or because if they touch the hoop or if they fall out, I get the point. And so what does it do? It teaches that community. It teaches that no one is left behind in our school. And then, we do the breathing strategy, but I also will, at the end of the game, sit them down. It's like, okay, you guys are going outside for recess. When you see that kid over there who's melting down or by themselves, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave them on an island? No, sir, we're not going to leave them on an island. We're going to go and we're going to go and include them. And it's not, no, sir. At my school, they actually call me by my first name. They call me Leroy, which I love. And so it just teaches kids to be inclusive. It teaches them to be in a community. And so when a kid does struggle with, with a disability of sorts, the kids aren't even shocked. They just know what to do with it, right? And I've got there's one particular kid who has ADHD, and he's in grade 3, and he's so distracted, and then he'll melt down because it's like, I don't know what I did with my backpack. I don't know what I did with this. He's starting to realize, he'll have a moment where he starts to realize all these things that have been left unchecked because he went from here to there to there. And he'll start to melt down and start crying. And it's like, no, you'll see students go, hey, no, I saw you in the comic space. Here's your backpack. It's all good. You can't find your snow boots. Don't worry. I saw you take them off. And these are what the other kids will do. And they bring them back and they compartmentalize them again. So then he can go back and then they can start being, scattered again. Right. Like, and that's the nice part, because the teachers see it too, because the teachers get really frustrated with kids who have ADHD because they need to find dopamine. And so when they're searching for dopamine, oftentimes it's an elastic band around the head, and they might be snapping it or jumping out from behind a door to scare somebody. And the teachers think, you can't behave like that. It's like, when you teach your teachers that the reason they're doing it is to search for that dopamine rush, they need it because they're, you talk to your kids about what ADHD is, then they understand. It's like, okay, this is why this kid is doing this. So how do we make sure that this kid has an elastic band on his chair so his feet can constantly be going all day? Or, and it's funny because I've found over the years that the kids that I've worked with that have ADHD, I always end up trying to stream them into drama, into acting, because they're the most creative kids in the world, because they're constantly searching for creativity, right? And it's so cool. And the more you can educate teachers around that, the less frustrated they get. And it's the same thing with parents who are new to ADHD, because what they do is they get those phone calls in kindergarten, grade 1. It's like, your kid is doing this, your kid is doing that. And they're like, and then they go home and they're frustrated because they're like, hey, go get your soccer gear. We're going to soccer practice. And they go to leave for soccer practice, and one shoe's in the bag, the other one's up on a ceiling fan, and he stuffed the wrong stuff into his backpack, and they don't understand why. It's like, I just told you 2 minutes ago what to put in your backpack. We made eye contact. You were supposed to be following me. And the kid will just be like, yeah. And the dad and mom are like, you lost it. It's like, yep. And you have to teach them that it's like, that's normal. That's part of being right. And so
understanding from the core on what it actually is.
yeah.
All right. So I ask every guest this. If you could share just one small actionable tip that parents can start using today, what would it be?
Be mindful of your time. Be mindful of attachment, because attachment is what's going to be the death of our kids in terms of their abilities to persevere and to show grit. And be mindful of your time so you can interact with your kids and get them back to what you did when you were drinking out of a garden hose in the 80s and 90s, right? Go back to that. They have a different world, but be mindful of that time so you can get them to be interactive with you and their peers, and mindful of time.
Yep. Yeah. Love it. Thank you, Leroy, for joining me today. You can definitely see your passion for this.
Thank you.
Shining through. As I said, I hope that this is the future of education. Please tell everyone where they can find your book and follow your work online.
Yeah, they can go to www.leroyslanzi.com, and on there is my book. If you want to book me for professional development, keynotes, any parent coaching, leadership coaching, everything's on there. They can also email me at leroyslanzi@gmail.com if they just want to ask a question. I'm always game for answering parents' questions. And where you are, it's literally from my house to Seattle is a 5-hour drive. Ironically, it's kind of crazy. So yeah, leroyslanzi.com and look me up, and I would love to start changing the world for sure with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again for joining us today. Listeners, I hope this episode has really given you an insight, a deeper understanding of how emotional intelligence and unstructured play can really, make this profound difference in your child's life. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with someone who might benefit. And as we said, share it with our teachers, share it with our principals, or even leave us a review. Listeners, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Soaring Child. I'm Dana Kay, your ADHD health practitioner. Keep on thriving. Thank you for listening to the Soaring Child podcast today. To learn more about how to help your child with ADHD soar using natural strategies, visit our website at adhdthriveinstitute.com and follow us on social media at ADHD Thrive Institute.